Hello, and welcome back to Your Story Stinks, Episode 9. This time, we're gonna slaughter another sacred cow. Because we're gonna be talking about Jack Kirby, and more specifically, the New Gods slash Fourth World, which are terrible. Now, the reason I say it's a sacred cow is because a lot of people, rightly so, look at Jack Kirby as one of the godfathers of comics. He is a hugely important figure in comics. He was a very creative individual, and he helped pave the way for a lot of characters and a lot of stories that came after him. All of that is true. He is undoubtedly one of the most creative people in comics, and he came up with lots of good ideas. The New Gods and Fourth World Saga are not one of them. And honestly, it's amazing that so many people reflexively defend it, having never read any of them and not really knowing anything about them besides the characters, because Jack Kirby was a phenomenal writer when it came to coming up with character ideas. So, for example, there's a reason why Darkseid still exists. There's a reason why lots of the figures of the Fourth World and the New Gods work. It's a reason why Mr. Miracle is still loved. There's a reason why characters like Big Barda are still loved, because they are good and creative characters. And Kirby did most of his best work, in my opinion, at Marvel, because when he was at Marvel, he was working alongside Stan Lee for things like Thor and Hulk. He worked on things like X-Men. He was very much the artist, and his art style is iconic, like truly iconic. And honestly, he's a very important figure in the beginning of the Silver Age. The Silver Age, personally speaking, is my favorite age of comics just because of their willingness to do anything and throw anything at the wall. And I respect Kirby for that. But while Kirby was an interesting creator and a good artist, he was not a particularly good storyteller, in my opinion. Like, he could arrange panels, and he pushed forward the medium in terms of visuals, but in my opinion, he was not a particularly great writer, because he let most of his personal beliefs and personal experiences color a lot of his writing, and we're going to get into that. So first and foremost, what do I mean by, like, his personal beliefs? So here's the thing. Kirby was fascinated with mythology, but he was, which is what most people know him for. He really liked creating, which is why things like Marvel Cosmic and DC's Fourth World really appealed to him. He did a lot of work on Thor, for example. But the problem with Kirby and doing a lot of these things is that one thing that colors a lot of his writing that got worse as he got older was his belief in absolutism. What I mean by that is that to Kirby, things are either good or evil. There is no such thing as a gray area. He is, in many ways, like Exhibit A of what people usually refer to when they talk about simplistic Silver Age storytelling, because to Kirby, there's no such thing as like nuance. There's no such thing as shades of gray. You're either good or you're evil, and all of that comes off in the New Gods, and all of that comes through in the Fourth World Saga. So, for example, you have New Genesis, a planet where everyone is good, led by Highfather, a Moses/Jesus-like figure who is super wise and always good. And then you have Apocalypse, ruled by Darkseid, where everyone is evil, all the families are evil. Darkseid is pure evil and anti-life. Everything is extremely black and white. and even the characters that he. So one of the things that he does is that he takes one character from each planet and he swaps them. So for example, Mr. Miracle ends up on Apocalypse and Orion ends up on New Genesis. And his idea is that, oh, this person is evil and he goes to the planet of good and then he becomes good because he chooses to embrace the ideas of these people who are good, even though he will always be evil, which later gets fleshed out in later, better, more nuanced writers. Whereas Mr. Miracle goes to Apocalypse, and he's basically the literal representation of man's desire to be free, because nothing can be like nuanced. Everything has to be on the nose, in your face, extremely literal all the time. And again, this is all because Kirby embraced a kind of absolutism in his personal life and in his writing. So part of this is also like his experiences during World War II and his belief between like fascism and freedom. And again, that really colors his writing. And it makes sense. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having personal experience color your writing, but the problem is that it just doesn't lead to good stories. Like, what people remember from his stories are always like, oh, all these creative ideas and all these like images of space and these like super science things and all these like fantastical concepts, but nobody's like referring to any specific stories because the stories themselves are not particularly good. Even by the day standard, everyone, when they talk about the Fourth World, and the New Gods, always refers to like the characters that have then become larger than life as later writers pick them up. So like Darkseid is an integral part of Superman's mythology, but nobody is like, oh yeah, nobody's particularly interested in the New Gods or the members of Apocalypse for themselves. And if you don't believe me, you can look at things like the Justice League movie, where they bring in guys like Steppenwolf, a character that does not have any depth to him and is obviously not complex in any way, because all of the characters that Kirby came up with are all super literal embodiments of what he believes in. Now, we have to do a little bit of a history lesson. So, Kirby, before he went to DC to make the New Gods, was writing Thor mostly. And one of the things that he struggled with working with at Marvel with Thor was that mythology is messy, because traditional classical mythology, whether it's Greek or Egyptian or Norse or what have you, is characterized by the fact that gods do not tend to be moral paragons. Obviously, for most people who are familiar with like Greek mythology and how it, like, a lot of the gods end up acting like dicks a lot of the time, like the concept that divine beings would not be moral like paragons is abhorrent to someone like Jack Kirby, because of what he believes. He believes that things are either good or evil. So the concept that a god like, say, Odin can do bad things and still be good is basically against everything Kirby believed. So after a while after writing stuff like this over at Marvel, which at the time you might remember is going through a little bit of a change, because Marvel's stories tended to be more complex, I guess you could say. So one of the stereotypes of Marvel and DC that in some ways unfairly persists to this day is that DC is very black and white and Marvel is more shades of gray. And all of this stems mostly from the early 70s and late 60s, because one of the things that happened when Stan Lee was inventing Spider-Man is that he had Jack Kirby try try to draw Spider-Man, and and Lee rejected it. Lee rejected it because he felt that the character was too heroic, and he wanted to write a character who was not obviously heroic. Now, obviously, Spider-Man is a very heroic character, but what he meant is he didn't want to write a character like Thor or Captain America. He wanted to write a more nuanced character, which, again, did not appeal to Jack Kirby. So, after all this, Jack Kirby goes to DC. I should point out that there's a lot of other things involved here about why he goes to DC, mainly contract disputes and the fact that Marvel, as a company, is terrible, and is terrible to this day in terms of, like, compensating artists and writers. DC isn't much better, but, yeah, basically he had a lot of disputes with Marvel on the business side of things, and with his dissatisfaction with a lot of the things that he was seeing and writing at Marvel, he jumped ship to DC. Which DC immediately is like, okay, we're gonna give you basically free reign in the beginning, and what he comes up with is the Fourth World. He comes up with the New Gods, which literally begins with him going, all the old gods die horribly. Like, the literal beginning is called the Epilogue, where essentially Jack Kirby depicts all of the old gods of the universe dying in horrible bloody warfare, so that he can create new gods for himself. That's where the name comes from. So essentially what he's done is he jumped ship to DC and then immediately depicts all of his old creations being horribly slaughtered in favor of new gods who are extremely literal depictions of what he believes morality should look like. And that's really why a lot of the stories aren't very interesting. Because while there's ideas that you can latch onto, again, I bring up Mr. Miracle, who is the literal embodiment of the human desire for freedom, living under, again, horrible, like, apocalyptic conditions on a planet literally called Apocalypse, and guys like Orion, who are bestial savages who are then enlightened as they go to the new world of New Genesis. Like, these are literal depictions. Like, these are cool ideas that you can play around with, but they don't particularly lend to lots of good storytelling, because literal depictions that are immutable doesn't really work very well. I should also point out that a lot of this stuff is not, like, these weren't new ideas for Kirby. So, one of the things that Kirby wanted to do before he left Marvel, that Marvel refused, was that he wanted to take Thor and make him into a cosmic figure, something which Marvel would do very much so later. But basically, he wanted to have, like, a cosmic alien battle with Thor, with, like, depicting Ragnarok, and have them all die. And just have them all horribly die. Like, that's literally the New Gods. Like, literally the New Gods is everybody that he depicted in the old stories that he wrote for Marvel all kill each other, and then the New Gods starts, and that was his, like, way of wiping the slate clean. He also tended to do things with the Inhumans, which I should point out only because the Inhumans are awful, and always have been, and at some point I will cover the Inhumans and how awful they are, because just as an idea, they're basically like they're just the X-Men light, essentially. In fact, Marvel really didn't push the Inhumans until Sony acquired the rights to the X-Men, and suddenly they couldn't use the X-Men for things, so they were like, okay, we'll use the next best thing. So what if we, like, get rid of all the X-Men, and we push the Inhumans, which is how things like House of M come to be, and, like, why, like, characters like Kamala Khan, which is a great character, like, legitimately a great character, but it's like how she comes to be. Like, her creation is literally a result of Marvel being like, we need people who are, like, exactly like the X-Men, but are not the X-Men, because we can't use them for other properties anymore. Anyway, getting back to the New Gods, one thing that's super important to understand is that this all worked in the late 60s, early 70s. Okay? All these ideas of, like, mixing in Bible stuff with bizarre science fiction concepts was completely in vogue in terms of, like, popular culture. So all of this stuff worked during, like, the hippie age of, like, oh yeah, we're gonna take Bible concepts and throw it onto, like, these wild concepts and these mythologies that essentially make no sense, but are all about, like, extreme, blatant symbolism that cannot be mistaken. Like, all of this stuff is super in vogue when he's writing all this. It doesn't age very well. Lots of writers have been inspired by this. It's very interesting to see how many writers have claimed that they are super inspired by this kind of writing, and then never write anything like it. It makes me feel a lot of the same way that lots of people say that, like, oh, Jack Kirby was a genius. And it's like, yeah, as an artist and as a designer, like, as a guy who could come up with ideas, but not as a writer. And so when people praise his writing, and what they mention is not his writing, but the characters, it makes me think that nobody's actually read any of his work. Or at least not the DC work that he did. At least not Fourth World. I'm not saying he's never done good work. It's just, he worked best when he had clear defined things to work within. He was one of those guys who, while he could be super creative and come up with amazing ideas, he couldn't really apply those ideas because of his own personal beliefs, which constantly got in the way. Again, you have a literal framework where one guy is literally the embodiment of everything good, and he lives on a planet full of good people who are, like, families of good people, and on the other planet is ruled by an evil man or an evil god, where all of the families are evil, but the concepts of good and evil don't really work. Like, trying to define what counts as good and evil is very hard. And this is why all of this is broken down in the decades that came after. So, like, for example, New Genesis and Apocalypse are both monarchies. Like, New Genesis is ruled by a dictator, Highfather, who everyone just goes, well, he's the smartest, wisest man, so everybody defers to him. There's no such thing as, like, voting or anything else. And obviously, as time has gone by, people have been like, the concept of the enlightened despot doesn't really work anymore. And, like, the concept that there's a figure who is always correct and always good because he lives in a universe where there is another guy who is always evil and always wrong, doesn't really work. Like, it's not interesting. That's the other problem with, like, Apocalypse, where you go, okay, what is evil? What does it mean to be an evil family? Like, if you were going to sit down and write an evil family and be like, this family is evil and they're bad, okay, but what does that mean? What do they do? What makes them different than any other family? And I don't mean in terms of, like, what they do to others. I mean, what does this mean in terms of, like, their interactions as a family unit? You know, like, many people would probably think of, like an abusive family situation, and that's possible, but it's kind of like, okay, but that's usually a dynamic where one family member is evil and inflicting things upon others. So, okay, so you have an evil husband and an evil wife, but are they evil in the same ways? The kids are also evil, so how are they evil? How does, like, the definition of evil work in this case? Evil in the Jack Kirby mind is on one hand super absolute and yet entirely nebulous. It's more like a vibe. It's not even really like a law. It's just a vibe that you just happen to be evil. And if you're born evil, you're never going to be good. Like, that's the thing about Orion, is that they write him going to, like, New Genesis and being civilized, and he's like, oh yeah, here is a savage who is going to New Genesis, and he learns modern, like, good ways, but he's still a feral savage underneath. And speaking of which, I'm not going to call him like Jack Kirby a racist, but he wrote some really racist things, which I guess was just par for the course in the 1970s, or the 1960s. Like, he came up with a supervillain called Yellow Claw, who is a blatant Yellow Peril Fu Manchu style figure. Granted, he also helped come up with Jimmy Woo, who you might know from various Marvel shows, as one of the agents, who's a legacy character they just threw in there. But yeah, I think it's more the time, but it's hard not to see a lot of this when you're depicting, like, literal, like, some people are born, like, some people are born savage and evil, and then they, even if you civilize them in good moral society, they will still be savage and evil deep down. Like writing that sort of thing today, like, if you pitched that idea to someone today, they would be very unhappy with you. It's to put the least. But again, a lot of this comes kind of down to, I think, the age, but again, this is a kind of moral absolutism. I'm not sure if it comes down the racist side, but I feel like it needs to be mentioned just because the age, like the time period, plus the themes that he's working with, seems very on the nose, like most of the stuff he did. Ironically, though, I don't know if Jack Kirby is necessarily to blame for everything that's gone wrong with them. So, here's the thing. I talk about the Fourth World, and I talk about Jack Kirby specifically, because his stories are a good embodiment of the Silver Age, in a lot of ways, especially DC, because, again, they're all, like, if you were said, okay, what do you think a Silver Age comic book is like, you would probably come up with something like Jack Kirby's Fourth World. It's all very, like, it's colorful, it's all over the top, it's all extremely literal, it's very cut and dry, good and evil. It's a whole lot of weirdness all over the place. And it works, but the problem is that it doesn't work, again, with the wider DC universe. And I know that sounds weird, because when you bring a guy in to literally create, new gods, and you literally set him down and be like, okay, your job is to create, like, literal mythology for our universe. How on earth can you mess that up? Well, first and foremost, you may have heard of a character called Wonder Woman, whose gods are still alive and quite literal. Also, they're very Greek, and they don't fit into this concept of a new god or a new race of gods. Like, one of the main problems with saying that they're gods is that they often directly interact with mortals. It's a bit like, you can't be like, okay, the Greek gods are super powerful and are so powerful that they can't be on Earth. Also, Orion and Mr. Miracle are gods, and they can be on Earth, but somehow they're not as powerful despite the fact that they're literally gods. Also, Superman can fight Darkseid. Again, none of this meshes together. Like, none of this meshes together at all. And as the series, like, as time went by and Kirby was removed from it, and, like, people moved on, you had a major problem where no one really knew what to do with the Fourth World or them, so they started, like making, they're like, okay, we'll flesh them out first, and so they did, and then they're like, okay, well, now what else do we do with them? What if we, I don't know, kill them all off, or introduce new characters that are behind these characters, or, I don't know, like, what if we, like, take these characters and try to incorporate them more, like, deeply into other stories? So, like, for example, one of the biggest ones is Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison is super inspired and super enjoyed the Fourth World, and especially Jack Kirby's style. And so he, as soon as he got his hands on being able to use big characters, he just started dragging all of them into his work. So like Orion, Mr. Miracle, Big Barda, all of these become a part of his like mythology. But of course, because you can't take control of the mythology without adding your own spin on it, he like creates the first superhero. So he's like, actually, deep in the past, all of these characters created the first superhero way in the past, and it was it was their creation. The New Gods did it. And then obviously, now we're deep into the Bronze Age. Now we're in the 2000s. And everything is gone like dark and gritty. Continuity makes no sense. Everything is kind of all over the place. We got the multiverse again, and none of it works. So what do we do with the New Gods? What do we do with these ideas? Okay, what if we kill them all and then we turn them into humans or like aliens, and then they protect a different world, and we just kind of settle it that way? Will that work? I guess, and that's what they did. And then obviously DC kind of shat the bed, and we're like, hey, let's do Flashpoint. And one day I'll get to Flashpoint and why it's terrible. But basically, Flashpoint is like, we made a lot of mistakes and killed a whole bunch of characters and made a whole lot of ideas, like old ideas, completely unworkable. So we need to just undo all of this. So Flashpoint happens, and they just erase everything they've done for the last 10, 20 years to go back again. But, like, now they still have no idea what to do with the New Gods. Like, the New Gods have not gotten any better. Like, there's nothing about the New Gods that have gotten any better. As more people have, as more people have come on to DC and tried to work with them, they've tried to, like, I guess introduce shades of gray to these concepts that are very literal, and it doesn't work because obviously they were created to be very specific literal interpretations. Like, you can't do Highfather is secretly like kind of evil, because if you do that, then he's really no different than Darkseid, and if he's no different than Darkseid, then New Genesis turns into just another hellscape, and then the whole like allegory doesn't work. And you go, well, they don't have to be allegories anymore. But if you do that, then there's no real point for them to exist. Like, that's the whole concept. It's very hard, I guess you could say. Which I guess kind of makes it fitting that guys like Dan Dido decided, yeah, let's just kill everything off and end it, because we don't know what to do with it. Like, we literally have no concepts. Let's just end it all and call it a day. And then they did, and then they had Flashpoint to then redo it again, which, like, you basically just undercut everything. And I guess it's fitting because, again, this is what happens when you don't create, like, specific stories and make everything work. Like, Kirby is a very creative writer, but he couldn't write stories because he was so focused on allegory and so focused on fantasy in the sense of like throwing every idea at the wall. It's a bit like how when people adapt things like Alice in Wonderland or the Chronicles of Narnia or things like that, they get kind of lost in the fantasy part, and so all of the meaning gets lost because like all the images are there, but all of the allegories and things are kind of just lost in the shuffle when new creators like attach themselves to it. Because Jack Kirby was all very, he's all very cut and dry. This is what is like, this is good, this is evil, these are the concepts, these are the allegories I'm working with. And changing them isn't really possible. So he couldn't really tell stories with them, and neither could anyone else. And I guess that's why they've just kind of been removed, in a sense. Like, they've removed the characters that people like and are interesting from the rest of the mythos. So it's like, oh, there's Darkseid, he's on Apokolips, and that's all that matters. Like, it doesn't matter that it's literally meant to be evil, because Darkseid is Darkseid. You know, it's like, oh, here's Mr. Miracle and Big Barda, and they represent whatever. And it's like, oh, here's Orion, he's like a space cop now, and just throw him into the mix. Like, their stories and their ideas have nothing to do with the greater, like, mythology of the Fourth World, because the Fourth World doesn't hold up. So this is kind of why I want to talk about it. It just kind of stinks, because it's not very good story-wise. Like, all the ideas are there, but it's not very good story-wise. I should say that, obviously, Jack Kirby didn't work on this forever. So what's really funny is that Jack Kirby came up with everything I've been talking about now in, like, 4 years, because he wasn't at DC Comics very long. So, like, when most people think Jack Kirby, they think of Marvel, for the most part. Like, he's at Marvel for over a decade, and he's like, I'm unhappy here, and I don't want to do this stuff anymore. And then he goes to DC, and he's only at DC for like 4 years, because after he writes The New Gods, and he writes, you know, The Fourth World, DC Comics is like, okay, you did all this stuff, but we don't know what are we going to do with any of this stuff? None of this really works. And so, like, essentially, DC Comics tries to rein Kirby in, and Kirby rejects it, and he's like, I'm done here. And so he only spends like 4 years at DC. He doesn't spend very long at DC, which is not really surprising with everything else. So he then is like, okay, I'm going to go back to Marvel. And he spends even less time at Marvel. Because one of the things you got to understand is that when he was at DC, he wrote a lot of how do I put this? Parodies of guys like Stan Lee. So he wrote characters like, here's a good example of a character called like Funky Flashman, who I had never heard of until I started doing a little bit of research for this series. Basically, he's a caricature of Stan Lee and Kirby's view of Stan Lee, and he's like a flashy grifter who is constantly looking for a cheap buck, who is always trying to cash in on things, who has no creative principles, like, at all. Like, he is Kirby is like, oh, I wasn't doing that in mean spirit. Like, I wasn't trying to make you feel bad, but it's a pretty mean-spirited, like, caricature of Stan Lee. Like, it feels very personal, like Kirby is working out something, and Stan Lee was very hurt by it, turns out. But anyway, then he goes back to Marvel. So think about a guy who wrote like caricatures of your old working partners and bosses, and then going back to work with them. And imagine how that worked out. It didn't go very well, essentially. But having said all that, he didn't stop creating, which I guess is not surprising. A guy like Jack Kirby, who is constantly in need of creation, who constantly needs to make new things, is not going to stop creating. And what he came up with is the Eternals. Okay, we've gotten like 3 strikes on terrible new mythologies with Jack Kirby. We started out with the Inhumans, and they're awful. And you move to the New Gods and the Fourth World, and they're awful. And then he's like, okay, I'm back at Marvel now. I'm going to make the Eternals, and they're even worse than either of the 2 things I have just mentioned. Like, the Eternals are so bad. Like, one day I'm going to do an episode on the Eternals. On just the Eternals. Because the Eternals, as a concept, are awful. Like, again, go back to his original run at Marvel. He's writing Thor, and he's struggling with the fact that mythology is messy and not literal. So he goes to DC to write literal gods and literal embodiments of polyistic mythology from the lens of, like, Christian morality. It it's even worse with like the Eternals, because he can't just create the Eternals who are like gods but not gods. Then he's like, okay, now there's the Celestials who are like all of this crap that gets folded in to like the core makeup of the Marvel universe utterly ruins a lot of parts of the Marvel universe to this day. Again, this is another case of the creator cannot stop creating and doesn't think of like how any of this fits together. Like, DC had no idea what to do with the New Gods at all once Jack Kirby left after 4 years, and Marvel had even less idea of what to do with the Eternals and what to do with the Celestials after like the 2 years that Kirby spent at Marvel again. One day we're going to get to the Eternals, but that's not what this video is about, so we're not going to focus much on them. Again, it just kind of, DC's Fourth World and Jack Kirby specifically don't really work as stories, and don't really work as mythology, and don't really work as settings, I guess you could say. Like, I mean, obviously Jack Kirby's not a setting. I mean that his creation doesn't work. Like, I think part of the issue is that for all of his, like, interest in mythology, his personal beliefs of, like, moral absolutism make it so that he can't actually recreate good mythologies. So, like, all of the reasons he was frustrated at Marvel when he was writing Thor are the reasons why the Fourth World doesn't work, and why, like, the New Gods don't work, because you can't write polytheistic mythology with Christian morality and expect anything good to come of it, because Christian morality is very cut and dry, and there aren't a huge amount of figures, mythologically speaking. Like, a lot of people later in, like, Gnosticism and things like that have branched out Christian mythology. But by and large, it's like there's God, and there's everything that's not God. Like, there's God, there's the devil. It's one or the other. It's very specific. In fact, a lot of Christian mythology just boils it down to those two. They even, like, you know, it streamlines a lot of things that are in the Old Testament. So, like, in the Old Testament, you know, Satan doesn't exist. It's a serpent in the garden, for example, who seduces Eve to eat the apple. But in Christian mythology and Christian retellings, it's, oh no, it was Satan. You know? They remove a character entirely to create a different character who takes much more of the story and creates a very, like, either-or situation. Things are good or they are sinful. And you can't apply that to any kind of, like Greek or Norse mythology archetype, because they don't have the same values. Like, the value sets and the way in which you tell stories does not work. And unfortunately, while the Bible has lots of, like, morally ambiguous figures, the problem is that Kirby's not interested in those. like characters, like David, for example, who is a conquering king, but also commits regicide and adultery and murders his best friend and lots of other things, who does really bad things, and yet, like, that kind of moral nuance is just lost on Kirby, who is a moral absolutist to his core. But anyway, that's all I got for this one. Hopefully I haven't offended too many people by not liking Jack Kirby's writing style. His art is still great, and he has lots of interesting ideas. It's just, he's just not a very good writer, in my opinion. But anyway, that's all I got. The story stinks, man. So, see y'all later.